All the relevant links are in the description of this video. A connection between the low-activity MAOA gene variants MAOA2R and MAOA3R and several types of antisocial behavior has been found. In my opinion, low-activity MAOA plays a greater role in criminality than low IQ, so less intelligent or less educated persons having more kids does not necessarily mean that their kids will automatically be more violent and criminal. People like Dr. Phil assume that a gene-environment interaction is synonymous with a genetic predisposition, but high-activity MAOA actually appears to play a protective role that negates an environmental trigger's impact. For instance, low IQ does not increase violent tendencies in men with MAOA4R, but it does in men with MAOA3R. The most effective way of reducing crime via birth control is to make sure criminals, especially female criminals, have fewer kids, not necessarily less intelligent persons. Children of criminal parents have a greater chance of becoming criminals themselves, a study has found. This transfer was the strongest from mothers to daughters, followed by mothers to sons, fathers to daughters, and then fathers to sons. The MAOA gene is X-linked, meaning that women carry 2 copies of it and either have 2 copies of the low-activity or high-activity allelic variant of the gene, or 1 copy of each. Men only carry 1 copy, either the high or low-activity version of MAOA. What this also means is that only mothers can pass on the different variants of MAOA to their sons, whereas both mothers and fathers each pass on 1 copy of MAOA to their daughters. The most effective way to reduce crime would be to sterilize repeat offenders. Roe v. Wade must include abortion access for women in prison. Judged inmates. Get sterilized and I'll shave off jail time. Under a standing order issued by General Sessions Judge Sam Benningfield, inmates in White County, Tennessee, can receive 30 days credit toward their jail time if they volunteer for vasectomies or contraceptive implants. This is reminiscent of 20th century American eugenics programs. One of the key ways the eugenics movement got going was with studies of families who were presented as unruly and not upstanding, a main one being the Jukes, a pseudonymous clan of rural whites, described in an 1877 study by sociologist Richard L. Dugdale as inbred degenerates whose hundreds of members placed an unacceptable burden on taxpayers. People like Steven Pinker claim that the warrior gene theory is bogus because East Asia does not have a warrior tradition or culture. The low-activity version of the gene is even more common in Chinese men, 55% of whom carry it, and the Chinese are neither descended from warriors in their recent history, nor particularly prone to social pathology in modern societies. Perhaps a little research into history would debunk his assessment here. The Chinese have throughout their history been governed under a feudal, agrarian, and hierarchical system, and China itself was always rife with wars, in fact far more frequently than colonial sea powers, and in larger scope all the way up till World War I. Steven Pinker also ignores or does not seem to be aware of the high number of pathological gamblers among Asians and Chinese. Research shows Asians in the US have a disproportionate number of pathological gamblers, i.e. addicted, as compared to the general American population. According to Dr. Timothy Fung, an associate clinical professor of psychiatry at the Semel Institute for Neuroscience and Human Behavior at UCLA and co-director of the UCLA Gambling Studies program, the rate of gambling addiction ranges from 6% to nearly 60%, depending on the specific Asian ethnicity, Southeast Asian refugees scoring highest, as opposed to the national rate of 1 to 2%. Low-activity MAOA is associated with pathological gambling, risk-taking and aggression, according to several studies. Important to understand in this context, and what distinguishes lower IQ from higher IQ high-frequency low-activity MAOA carrier populations and groups, is that higher IQ low-activity MAOA carriers can much better gauge and calculate risk than lower IQ low-activity MAOA carriers can, and therefore engage in very different types of crimes, white-collar crime as opposed to violent crime, and they do so often undetected and much more successfully than their fellow lower IQ low-activity MAOA carriers. Psychopathy researcher Dr. Kevin Dutton pointed this out. However, if you've got those aggressive traits I've just mentioned to you and you are not naturally violent and you are also intelligent, then it's a different story altogether. Then, as the famous Reuters headline once mentioned, you are more likely gonna make a killing in the market than anywhere else.